May 30th, 1964, the Indianapolis 500, America's most sacred racetrack, erupts into chaos. Flames tear across the speedway, black smoke curls toward the grandstands, and in the carnage, 2 drivers lose their lives. To fans, it was tragedy. To Ford, it was something even darker. A public relations nightmare. Their brand-new 255 cubic inch V8, a radical dual overhead cam design years in the making, was supposed to be the weapon that would topple the Offenhauser dynasty. Instead, it was now tied to death, suspicion, and disaster. Newspapers questioned whether Ford's gamble had gone too far. In garages across Indy, whispers spread. Maybe the old Offy, a relic from the 1920s, had survived this long for a reason. Maybe Ford had tried to leap too far, too fast. The truth, though, was more complicated. Beneath the smoke lay a secret. Bobby Marshman's Lotus Ford had been leading the race by a staggering 90 seconds when a simple oil leak ended his day. His engine wasn't destroyed. It had survived the punishing pace. The real mechanical failures that caused fire and loss of life weren't Ford's alone, but in the public eye. The revolutionary Ford V8 teetered on the edge of ruin. That race set the stage for one of the most dramatic engineering wars in motorsport history. At the center was a question that cut to the bone. Could Ford, the symbol of American industry, reinvent Indy racing itself, or would it be buried under the weight of tragedy? Ford's engineers, executives, and drivers felt the heat. The stakes were no longer just about winning a race. This was about redemption, about proving that innovation could overcome disaster. To walk away now would mean confirming every critic's sneer that Ford's futuristic engine was nothing but a deadly experiment. But to push forward meant confronting grief, mechanical flaws, and political betrayal head-on. And at the core of this story was Don Frey, Ford's maverick VP, who had gambled his career on the project. He believed that the only way to honor those who had fallen and silence the doubters was to double down. The 1964 tragedy wasn't the end of Ford's engine. It was the crucible that hardened it. And to understand why Frey risked everything, you have to go back to 1962, when Indy was a museum ruled by a single outdated king, and Ford decided to burn it down. By 1962, Indianapolis wasn't a battlefield, it was a museum. The cars all looked the same, heavy front-engine roadsters powered by one engine and one engine only, the Offenhauser Offy. Born in the 1920s, the Offy had become motorsport's mob boss, controlling every grid spot. From 1950 to 1962, it powered 416 out of 429 qualifiers. It won 15 straight Indy 500s. Mechanics, teams, and drivers all bowed to it. Nobody dared to challenge it. Innovation at Indy had withered under its shadow. But Don Frey, Ford's maverick vice president, didn't see dominance. He saw stagnation and weakness. A restless strategist who thrived on risk, Frey wanted to jolt Indy awake. At a time when Ford's corporate culture worshipped safety and predictability, he secretly plotted revolution. He called in his closest allies, Bill Gay, Ford's advanced engines chief, Mauro Forghieri, a consultant with European flair, and Phil Remington, the brilliant weight-obsessed engineer from Shelby's Cobra program. Frey's plan was audacious. Take a modest Ford Fairlane V8, shrink it down to 255 cubic inches, crown it with dual overhead cams, and make it scream to 8,000 RPM. While the Offy was a hulking iron giant, Ford would field a lightweight, high-revving Predator. Insiders called it Project Suicide. If it failed, it could humiliate Ford on the biggest racing stage in America and almost certainly end Frey's career. But Frey wasn't chasing safety, he was chasing legacy. To him, beating the Offy was more than racing. It was about breaking a cartel. He wanted an engine so radical it would either destroy the competition or destroy him, and that risk was intoxicating. His rallying cry to his engineers captured the spirit. Gentlemen, we're not just building an engine, we're starting a revolution. The stakes weren't lost on anyone. Ford wasn't just investing in horsepower, it was gambling its reputation, its pride, and the very idea that American innovation could outthink decades of tradition. For the first time in generations, the balance of power at Indianapolis wavered. But revolution needs allies, and as fate would have it, Ford's most unlikely partners were already circling Indy, a hot shoe driver named Dan Gurney and a British genius named Colin Chapman. Their meeting with Ford would ignite the chain reaction that turned Indy upside down. Dan Gurney wasn't just a driver, he was a connector, a man who saw possibilities others overlooked. In early 1962, Gurney won the Daytona Continental, a victory that raised eyebrows across the racing world. That win earned him a shot at the Indianapolis 500, driving for Mickey Thompson, the hot-rodding innovator who loved breaking rules. Thompson fielded a car with a Buick V8 tucked behind the driver radical for Indy at the time. Gurney qualified 8th, ran in the top 10 all day, and looked poised to shock the establishment until the transmission failed. On paper, it was a disappointment. But in reality, something much bigger was happening. That day, Gurney invited a friend to Indianapolis, Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus. Chapman was already a legend in Europe, the mastermind behind lightweight Formula One cars that embarrassed bigger, richer teams. To him, Indy had seemed like an irrelevant American spectacle, just heavy roadsters pounding in circles. But once Gurney convinced him to attend, Chapman's eyes lit up. He studied the Offy-powered dinosaurs with disbelief. On the flight from Indy to the Monaco Grand Prix, he couldn't stop talking. To him, Indy wasn't closed, it was wide open. Chapman's vision was beautifully simple. Forget brute force, win with efficiency. Build a featherweight chassis, pair it with a compact high-revving Ford V8, save time on pit stops, outlast the lumbering Offys, not with luck, but with logic. When Chapman and Gurney sat down with Ford executives in Dearborn, many scoffed. The Offy head ruled for decades. Who was this British tinkerer to claim he could rewrite Indy in one stroke? But others, like Bill Gay, saw the genius. Championship car racing had stagnated. Chapman offered disruption. And so, an unlikely alliance was forged. Lotus would supply the chassis, Ford the power plant. Gurney would be the bridge between them, the driver who knew both worlds. Together, they weren't just building a car, they were conspiring to overthrow an empire. The plan was bold, the risks immense, but once Ford committed, the floodgates opened. Engineers began transforming a humble Fairlane small block into a weapon, while Chapman sketched a car that looked nothing like an Indy roadster. The Lotus 29 was coming, and with it, a revolution Indy could no longer ignore. Ford's engineers faced a paradox. To topple the Offy, they couldn't just throw brute horsepower at the problem. They had to be smarter, lighter, and more precise. Their canvas was the modest 260 cubic inch Fairlane V8, a compact engine already tested in the first Shelby Cobras. On the street, it made about 260 horsepower. At Indy, that wasn't even close. So began a series of ruthless experiments. First came the pushrod prototypes, tested against an actual Offenhauser Ford had quietly purchased. On the dyno, the Offy churned out 401 horsepower at 6,000 RPM. The Fairlane block struggled to keep pace until the engineers uncovered a secret. Engines tuned for torque, not just peak horsepower, clocked faster lap times. Why? Because torque hurled cars out of corners harder, even if the top speed dropped a tick. That insight rewrote Ford's design philosophy. The next phase pushed boundaries further. Engineers stripped iron for aluminum, shaving the block down to 72 pounds, with each cylinder head a mere 16 pounds. The numbers looked promising, but on the dyno, reality bit back. Valves bounced at high RPM like rattlesnakes, threatening to shred the engine from within. Worse, carburetors became a choke point. The 46M Webers couldn't feed enough air and fuel to keep the engine alive at speed. Bill Gay refused to accept defeat. When Weber declined to make larger units, he flew straight to Italy. Through persistence and a favor owed from years earlier, he convinced Weber's chief engineer to build custom 58M carburetors, exclusively for Ford. Back in Dearborn, those carbs transformed the engine. On the dyno, it screamed to life with 460 horsepower at 6,800 RPM. Then came the ultimate test, 24 hours at full throttle. Mechanics watched nervously as the clock ticked, expecting catastrophe. But the engine survived, hot, battered, and loud but intact. For the first time, Ford had an Indy V8 that looked ready to challenge the Offy empire. Yet reliability remained fragile. Valve harmonics lingered, a hidden time bomb waiting at high RPM. Chapman grew restless, hinting that Lotus might walk away if Ford couldn't guarantee durability. Still, the taste of power was intoxicating. The Lotus 29 was nearly ready, and the revolution was no longer theory. It was about to roar down Gasoline Alley, shocking Indianapolis into a new era. By 1963, the pieces were in place. Colin Chapman's Lotus 29 was low-slung, mid-engined, and unlike anything the Brickyard had ever seen. When it rolled into Gasoline Alley, the traditionalists scoffed it looked like a toy compared to the hulking Offy roadsters, but on qualifying day, Jim Clark stunned them all. The Lotus Ford clocked speeds good enough for the front row, proving Chapman's radical formula wasn't fantasy. On race day, the car's efficiency shone. While Offy roadsters guzzled fuel and chewed through tires, the Lotus needed fewer pit stops, gliding through laps with grace. Clark fought hard, and when the dust settled, the Lotus Ford finished second place in its Indy debut. It wasn't a victory, but it was an earthquake. The crowd had witnessed the dawn of the rear-engine revolution. The Offy empire was suddenly on notice. But progress never comes without pain. Fast forward to May 30, 1964. Ford returned with an improved version of their DOHC V8, now roaring with more confidence. 7 Ford-powered cars took the green flag, including Bobby Marshman, Eddie Sachs, and Clark himself. Early on, Marshman looked unstoppable, opening up a staggering 90-second lead. For a brief moment, it seemed inevitable. Ford would finally dethrone the Offy. Then came disaster. A horrific crash involving Eddie Sachs and Dave McDonald ignited a firestorm on the track, claiming both drivers' lives. The sight of flames engulfing Indy shook fans, teams, and Ford itself. Though investigations later showed the engines weren't at fault, Marshman's motor had actually survived intact. The stigma stuck. Ford's revolutionary V8, born to challenge tradition, was now entangled with tragedy. Inside Ford, tempers flared. Lee Iacocca demanded an inquiry. Chapman faced calls for his firing over his insistence on Dunlop tires, which some blamed for the chaos. Jim Clark, rattled by the carnage, vowed never to return to Indianapolis. And yet, hidden in the ashes was a glimmer of hope. Marshman's Lotus Ford hadn't failed because of the engine. It had failed because of a broken transmission plug, a human error. The DOHC V8 itself had passed its trial by fire. For the engineers who had bet everything, this meant one thing. The project wasn't dead, it was hardened. The 1964 race marked Indy's darkest hour, but it also lit the fuse for Ford's ultimate redemption. The following year, Clark would return, and with him came the chance to prove that Ford's so-called suicide project wasn't suicide at all, but destiny. The 1964 Indianapolis 500 nearly buried Ford's dream. Fire, tragedy, and suspicion turned their DOHC V8 into a scapegoat. Jim Clark swore he'd never return. But corporate pride doesn't die so easily. Ford executives knew walking away would mean surrendering Indy to the Offenhauser dynasty once again. So they doubled down, refining the engine, tightening its weaknesses, and preparing for redemption. By May 1965, the tide had turned. Clark was coaxed back behind the wheel of the new Lotus 38, a car designed specifically for Ford's 255cc double overhead cam V8. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Across the paddock, 24 of the 68 cars entered were powered by Ford. The Brickyard had never seen such an invasion. Mechanics whispered it was no longer the Indianapolis 500, it was the Ford 500. When Clark rolled off from pole position, skeptics still wondered, could the engine endure 500 miles? Could a foreign driver in a fragile-looking British chassis survive against Detroit's roadsters and the old Offy warhorses? The answer came with brutal clarity. Clark led 190 of 200 laps, yielding the lead only during pit cycles. The Lotus Ford was a machine possessed, efficient, unstoppable, and perfectly tuned. The Wood brothers, NASCAR legends imported to handle pit duties, delivered lightning-fast stops, one in under 20 seconds, a record for the era. Not a single Ford engine failed Clark's car. When the checkered flag fell, Jim Clark became the first foreign driver to win Indy since 1920, and Ford's revolution was complete. This was more than victory. It was coronation. The Offenhauser's decades-long reign crumbled in real time. The Lotus Ford didn't just beat the old guard, it embarrassed them. The crowd witnessed what insiders already knew: the rear-engine revolution was permanent, and the Ford DOHC V8 had become the beating heart of the new era. In boardrooms back in Dearborn, Ford executives smiled. The gamble that had begun as Project Suicide was now their crown jewel. A passenger car block transformed into a 425 horsepower screamer had rewritten racing history. But revolutions never stay contained. The same engine that ruled Indy would soon spread across racing's frontiers, winning year after year, and even finding new life in NASCAR, USAC, and drag strips. The Phoenix had risen, and its wings were only beginning to spread. By 1965, the revolution was no longer a theory, it was fact. Jim Clark's victory had toppled the Offenhauser empire, but Ford wasn't content with just one win. The 255cc DOHC V8 had proven itself reliable, efficient, and devastatingly fast. Now, the question was, how far it could go. The answer came in numbers that stunned even Ford's executives. Between 1965 and 1971, the engine-powered winners of the Indy 500 6 times. 1965, 1966, 1967, 1979, 1970, and 1971. Even in 1967, long after Ford had officially stepped back, a derivative of the engine took victory again. What began as Project Suicide had become one of the most successful engines in the race's history. Its reach extended beyond Indy. Ford entrusted Louis Meyer, the legend behind the Offy, to manage engine sales and service in Indianapolis. The irony was unmistakable. The very architect of the Offenhauser dynasty was now selling its replacement. By 1966, nearly every competitive team at the Brickyard wanted a Ford V8. The paddock, once an Offy fortress, had transformed into a sea of blue ovals. And yet, the legacy wasn't just measured in trophies. The Ford DOHC engine symbolized something greater: the willingness to break tradition and suffer losses in pursuit of transformation. Its aluminum block, its exotic four-valve heads, and its willingness to spin at 8,000 RPM had dragged IndyCar into the modern era. Chapman once described it as smooth like a turbine. Drivers said it felt lighter, more alive than anything they'd ever raced. It didn't just change the cars, it changed the sport's philosophy. Efficiency, aerodynamics, and innovation became the new weapons. By the early 1970s, Ford's program was handed to A.J. Foyt, who continued its dominance under his own name. Drag racers even experimented with it, dropping the DOHC V8 into NHRA chassis, where its engineering brilliance earned awards for best design. Though its time as a factory-backed program ended, its DNA lived on in countless spin-offs and adaptations. The legacy of Ford's 255cc Indy V8 is this: it proved that revolutions are born from defiance. From betrayal and tragedy in 1964 to absolute coronation in 1965, it turned Detroit's skepticism into dominance. And decades later, its legend still whispers through racing history, the engine that killed the Offy and remade Indianapolis forever. So there you have it, the dark side of Ford's 255 Indy engine, a creation that promised dominance but carried dangers too heavy to ignore. It's a reminder that even legends can come with a deadly price tag. What do you think was the risk worth the reward? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you love uncovering the hidden stories of racing history, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you won't miss what's next on Muscle Cars Revolution.